Hello and welcome to the Squatting Puffin. Today we get to step away from economics and history and talk about my favorite, philosophy. Let's take a look at Hegel. Hegel! Butt Puffin, you get over here! Get your butt over here! So today, for our first foray into philosophy, we get to talk about a philosopher who, unfortunately, is a good example of how not to do philosophy. Oh, and no butt puffin today. He's off taking a break while we talk big brain things. But he's off taking a break. So, to truly understand a movement, you really have to understand the roots of that movement. It's easy to get lost in catchphrases and mantras and slogans and not really know what moves a movement or what it actually believes. For example, every American knows the phrase, "no taxation without representation," as a reason for the Revolutionary War. But so few Americans have read the Declaration of Independence that many often can't name any other reason for the revolution. Hint, taxes is only one of 27 issues in the Declaration, and nowhere near the most grievous. Thomas Jefferson even wrote a passage in the original draft condemning King George for having, quote, "waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in persons of a distant people, who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death on their transportation thither. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce," unquote. Yes, the Declaration of Independence almost had a section talking about how evil it was of King George to have brought the slave trade to America. But it was cut out to get certain delegates from the South to sign it. So today, talking about roots of movements, we'll be talking about Hegel, the scientific method, and his scientific method. For anyone who slept through their middle school science class, you might have missed something called the scientific method. In a really, really brief rundown, it goes something like this. You notice something you really want to understand. You come up with an idea about how you think it works. You perform the tests to see if you're right. If the test passes, then you let people know how you did it so they can try to prove you wrong. If the test didn't pass, then you were wrong and you need a better idea. A phrase I'm going to use a bit in this video is a Latin one, a priori. A priori refers to knowing something without any observations or experiences. There are places that this is appropriate, but science isn't one of them. Science is by its nature empirical, meaning based on observation and experience. It's the opposite of a priori. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a philosopher in the early 1800s. And to those of you who cringed from my pronunciation of a German name, know that my German isn't rusty, because to be rusty I have to have had it in the first place. He talked about a lot of things and influenced the philosophies of Germany and its surrounding countries for years to come, and greatly influenced German idealism for the 1800s and 1900s. You know, the centuries that Germany is really well known for its world building, if you know what I mean. Hegel's works can be summed up by a quote from his work, Elements of Philosophy of Right, quote, "The rational alone is real," end quote. So let's break that down really quick. In 384 BC, the philosopher Aristotle wrote down how everything worked. He basically invented physics as he thought really hard about everything and then explained it. Among his explanations was the a priori statement that heavier things fall faster than lighter things. Sounds reasonable, no one questioned it, and it was held as a fact for many years. Almost 2,000 years later, Galileo proved that some of Aristotle's physics were wrong when he dropped 2 balls from the not-yet-leaning Tower of Pisa and showed that weight didn't make a difference. Hopefully this isn't a revelation for you since it was done close to 500 years ago, but in case you didn't know, gravity doesn't care how much you weigh when it comes to how fast it pulls you. About 150 years after that, Isaac Newton mathematically calculated gravity and how it worked, and built the first real physics through testing and observation. Nearly 100 years after Isaac Newton disproved with empirical experimentation the long-held a priori Aristotelian physics, and over 200 years after Galileo did the same, Hegel declared that you didn't need to perform experiments to learn things because it could all be figured out by big-brained reasoning. Because, quote, "whatever is in nature is realized in a higher form in the mind which emerges from nature," unquote. So basically, because your brain came from nature, it understands nature in some higher form and only rational things are real, which is to say nothing empirical is real, which is to say the results of experimentation and observation aren't as true as just thinking about it hard, like Aristotle did in ancient Greece. In case you were unable to put together where this goes, I'll link a post by a physicist whose husband is a Hegelian philosopher, or at least was as of 2 years ago when the post was made. But to summarize the post, their marriage was in trouble because he kept trying to correct her physics because it didn't align with what Hegel thought physics should be clear back in the 1800s. And whenever she tried to gently correct him for his complete lack of understanding of the science, he said he didn't need any of that proof because according to Hegel, thinking about it is more accurate than any of the evidence she might have ever come up with from experimentation. Because no one who's thought about something has ever been proven wrong before. Basically, while the scientific method is observe, idea, test, conclusion, Hegel's scientific method is idea, conclusion, I'm right because my idea is a good one, done. Another thing that Hegel came up with is what's known as the Hegelian Dialectic. The idea on this is that things, which he called a thesis, bring about their opposites, called an antithesis, which then bring about a synthesis of those two things called a synthesis. Then that synthesis becomes a thesis for the next cycle to continue. So let's gloss over the idea of opposites becoming the same thing and the idea that this new mixture of a thing and its opposite is somehow going to have an opposite in itself, because that's insanely diametric thinking. And let's just go on to how vague the Hegelian dialectic is. Given the incredibly vague concept of opposites when talking about things like taxation or government structure or societal structure, etc., and the exceptionally vague concept of a synthesis of opposites, it's kind of like a prophecy that you can't actually tell the future with, but in retrospect you can fit any outcome into it. I'll give you an example. Thesis: raising taxes on the rich increases tax income. But then antithesis: it leads to a decrease in tax income because they move away or hire accountants to figure out how to reduce their taxes, which synthesis leads to a complex cat-and-mouse tax law that hurts everyone else. But you could use the exact same reasoning structure and line of reasoning to foretell this story in the way socialists always expect it to go. Thesis: raising taxes on the evil rich increases tax income, but then antithesis: they cease to be rich because we've taken their money, and they cease to be evil because they're no longer rich, which leads to synthesis: the world is equalized and devoid of evil people. These are two completely different stories, completely different prophecies, completely different expectations, but they're both technically a Hegelian dialectic. Hegel thought that this form of reasoning through something was the process of rationally figuring out the truth, even though its path is so arbitrary. So we can break it down thusly. Hegel didn't think that evidence was necessary to know things, and the way to figure things out was an arbitrary thought cycle that could diverge in any direction you wanted it to, the result of which would be absolute truth, not a great foundation for science. I'm sure that Hegel had to have done other things that weren't as crazy or stupid, but thanks to Butt Puff, and the purpose of this video isn't to learn about all of Hegel's ideas, but rather to learn about the ones that changed history, the roots of the movement, so to speak. Karl Marx, if you couldn't tell by the spelling, was a German as well. He was born in 1818, and he was greatly influenced by Hegel's philosophy. When you look at his prophecy that the workers would rise up against the rich and overthrow them in a massive revolt that would lead to the utopia, you can see the idea of the Hegelian dialectic at work. Rich people oppress the poor. This leads to the poor oppressing the rich. This leads to neither rich nor poor, so utopia of equality. Note, this didn't happen. Instead, the middle class became a thing. The need of the workers to rise up ceased to be a need as working conditions naturally improved thanks to growing economies reducing poverty and suffering in the world, but you can see my Labor Day video about that. Also, I don't know how he didn't follow up on that, because the entire idea of the Hegelian dialectic is that these ideas continue infinitely, and I don't know how you can look at the conclusion utopia of equality as the beginning of the next dialectic cycle and find an opposite for it in any way that doesn't spell out dystopia. But I guess to follow up your Hegelian dialectic with a second cycle, you have to be big-brained like Hegel, and I guess Marx just wasn't. But if you come from a background of Hegel, Marx's reasoning is sound, and as you know, reason is truth regardless of the facts, so many communists are still awaiting and even actively trying to bring about the prophesied revolution because 1, it's inevitable, and 2, it will of course bring about the absolute utopia in every way, saving the planet and saving the people. Marx claimed that his analysis of the march of history was highly scientific, but he wasn't referring to the scientific method as we know it when he said this. And, I mean, fair enough, the scientific method as we know it really wasn't perfected until Karl Popper got his hands on it a century later. But he's an interesting and actually smart philosopher to talk about another time. No, Marx was referring to Hegelian science. It was scientific because he thought super hard about it and broke it down into a thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But despite the lack of need for experimentation, when the 20th century hit, we got our experiments about communism regardless. Rudolf Rummel, the demographer of government mass murder, estimated the following results. 61 million were killed in the Soviet Union. 78 million were killed in communist China, which continues to this day in the form of the modern Uyghur genocide, and roughly 200 million were killed worldwide from communist uprisings. These deaths were brought about by state-organized famines such as the Holodomor, violent collectivization, cultural revolutions, class and genetic purges, military campaigns against unearned income, and experiments of social engineering, all in an attempt to create the utopia explained by Marx. No other century has rivaled the 20th for revealing the raw capacity of humans to cause suffering in the name of progress, because when the ends justify the means and the end is an infinite paradise, it will come by any means necessary. For those who learn from history, this is evidence enough that communism is a dangerous, bloody road, to the point that very few people today willingly associate themselves with communism publicly, despite how many people promote its ideas and concepts under other names. But to the communists, they look to the 20th century and say, that wasn't real communism. Though there are lists of conspiracy theories and excuses as to why none of these states that were praised as being real communism ended up being real communism by the end, the real reason they refute it is simple. To the empirical scientist, the experiment has done, multiple times, too many times to be ethical, and the deaths of millions with ultimate societal collapse or the rise of dystopian horror states as the results shows conclusive evidence communism is anything but a utopia. To the Hegelian, though, communism has already been reasoned out to be a utopian state. Anything short of that must have been sabotaged by the evil capitalists, or poorly run, or destroyed by mankind just not being ready, because they already know, a priori, no evidence needed, that communism works. And when no amount of evidence is needed to make that assertion, no amount of evidence can dissuade you from the truth of it. You would think that a science based in philosophy would recognize a special pleading fallacy when it happens, but that would be to reject the Hegelian Dialectic's prophetic ability. At this point, to believe in communism, you have to be willingly blind, a midwit who is obsessed with solving the impossible puzzle of utopia, or a useful idiot for those who desire power above all else. So the next time someone says real communism has never been tried, realize you're talking to someone who literally takes it on faith. A faith in a philosopher from the 1800s who didn't think that things actually happening in front of him were as real as things he thought about. If you understand the roots of the ideology, you'll understand better how people could believe it, and you'll understand better how to address its flaws. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like if you didn't hate it, subscribe if you don't hate me, and share this video with people you know because I'm not good enough for YouTube to share anything for me. Also, leave a comment because that's how YouTube knows that this video was good enough for them to share it. Also, I have a Patreon if you wanted to be a patron of my content. I don't expect your support, but if you wanted to, at the middle tier you can get yourself a mug with butt puffin on it, and it would really help me get some of the production equipment I lack. Take care and we'll see you next time.